Now, in the last module, I suggested that we were going to find that the discussants ultimately reject this metaphorical theory of the mind as a means of explaining or helping them to understand false opinion generally. Now, there are a number of different things that get discussed in this rejection, and so students might get kind of confused by it. There are some problems that Plato/Socrates points to, and then there's the one definitive problem that leads them to reject it. So what are the sort of difficulties, at least prima facie problems, that Socrates/Plato points to that look problematic? Well, on this view, false opinion consists only in the mismatching of an impression of sensation with an impression of memory. So only when you have both and you mismatch them do you get false opinion. And Plato/Socrates goes through a number of different cases. Even in the dialogue, Theaetetus claims to be confused by this. So let's talk about those just a little bit to get a better sense of them. He doesn't put all his rejection marbles in that box, but what he does do is point to these as difficulties potentially for this view, even in the best case scenario. So in order to have a false opinion on this view, you have to have an impression of memory and you have to have an impression of sense in order to match them together. And so Plato then considers, well, what happens when I don't have an impression of sense or an impression of memory? This view needs to be modified somehow to accommodate cases like that if it's even possible. So suppose that I don't have a sensory, or not, I don't have an impression of memory. And I'm looking down the street and I see someone coming down the street. I don't have an impression of memory for them, but instead I match them to Theaetetus. Now on this view, I've got a mismatch of sensory experience with an impression of memory, but I don't have the regular impression of memory. There isn't a right answer in this scenario. And so that might seem problematic right there. In addition to that, suppose that I don't have a sensory impression for someone walking down the street, and I say, hey, I don't know who that is. That seems like a correct judgment. But the theory requires a matching of sensory impression to impression in ball of wax. And so there isn't a matching there. There isn't a mismatching there. So it doesn't look like we can say that that's a true opinion because there isn't a correct matching. It's not a false opinion because there isn't an incorrect matching because there isn't anything there. There are other problems that he worries about as well. When we think about comparing objects in our visual field, is this the same kind of object as this object? Is this the same color as this object? And so on. He says, well, there's no direct mechanism for doing that because these are sensory impressions that are being compared, and the theory all operates on impression of memory being matched with impression of sensation. So these are all potential problems for the view just within the realm of perceptual categorization. And that seems problematic. But we might mess around with this view. We might introduce things that might take care of some of these cases. But the objection that really leads the discussants to reject this particular metaphorical theory of mind and its corresponding account of false perceptual categorization is the idea that, look, I can have false perceptions, false inferences, false categorizations in the absence of perceptual experiences. In fact, I may even have concepts that don't have any corresponding perceptual experiences. And so for Plato, numbers themselves aren't things that you perceive. You perceive numbered objects, but you don't perceive numbers. So you don't perceive 5, even though you may perceive 5 fingers on someone's hand. And so there isn't a perception corresponding to 5-ness or 7-ness, but Plato says, I can make correct judgments that 5 plus 7 equals 12, and I can make incorrect judgments that 5 plus 7 equals 11. So that seems to be a false opinion. 5 plus 7 equals 11, and yet there is no corresponding mechanism for helping us to understand how that could be a false opinion in this particular metaphorical theory and account of false opinion. In other words, Plato has been focused on this one case, this one guiding metaphorical way of thinking about the application of knowledge, perceptual categorization. Now he broadens his scope a bit to think about not just false opinion as arises in cases, individual cases of perceptual categorization, but false opinion that arises more generally. And he says this looks troubling, right? It looks like we are able to think about things and to even have false opinions or make false judgments about things absent actually having a perception in a particular instance or absent the ability to even perceive these things. And this theory doesn't provide us with any mechanism for understanding that. And so ultimately, this will be why the group moves on from this view to the next view, to try and come up with a more general account of false opinion, a different theory about the nature of the mind and having knowledge that allows for false opinion to arise outside of the context of mapping a sensory impression to a memory impression, which is all this particular view does. And we'll pick that up in the next lecture module.